Welcome to the History Nerd Night podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Eleanor Barraclough. Listen, we talked for so long. It's about Vikings. And what can I say except that Eleanor and I talked for over an hour, and it might have been one of the easiest hours of interviewing I've ever done. She has so much energy. She's so excited, and she was so game to just answer questions and throw stuff off the wall. I had so much freaking fun. I'm going to shut up so you can hear it. Let's talk to Eleanor. And here we are with author Eleanor Barraclough. Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Eleanor, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to get onto the book as fast as possible, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about your social media presence. Now, I've followed you on Instagram. I've watched the videos. I was trying to come up with how to describe them, and I've come up with this. Wonderfully zany. How do you feel about that? Does that...
So relieved, right? So I only joined Instagram in January, having promised I would never ever be on social media because all I saw was people looking rather shiny and doing beautiful things. I thought, I'm never going to be able to be shiny and do beautiful things. And so when I finally was persuaded on there by my excellent US publishers, I decided, right, well, here we go. Let's do it my way. So wonderfully zany, that is the biggest compliment I've had. I will definitely take that.
I mean, not many authors are selling their book with Led Zeppelin in the background. I think you nailed it. Well, it's also, looking at anything, because you're on BBC, you're on this, you seem to be having the most wonderful time. Are you faking it, or is it that much fun what you do?
No, it really is. Literally, right. So I'm in the potting shed where a lot of those Instagram videos are filmed. But look, I'm just going to bring out here. That is Jormungandr, the world serpent, in Lego form. You see, riding a Viking or rather the Viking is riding Jormungandr, but who is wielding a cup of coffee there. Got some sort of Dungeons and Dragons like floating in the back. I'm like, look, if we're going to do this, let's have fun with it. Otherwise, what's the point? You know, I nearly went into advertising. I'd have earned a lot more money, but that was not fun. So let's have some fun and meet some cool people.
Now, all of the Legos that I just saw are on the Instagram, people. Just go right there. You don't have to go search too far. They're right there.
See, I feel bad now because this little sort of, she's a druid dwarf and she didn't end up there. So there you go. So you can see them all. They're all there and more. Oh, and I've just got a Viking village that has just been finished. So that's going to appear at some point on the Instagram.
Now, are the Legos all you, or is that a family thing with the kiddies?
Full disclosure, I'm really good at playing with Lego. I'm really bad at making Lego. And so, you know, the family gather around, have a lovely time, and then I just get to sort of open the doors and move the figures around. And yeah, I can't tell you how bad I am at making it. That is not my forte.
That's not the point of it anyway. The point of it is to just start jam things together and see what happens.
That's what I will say. Luckily, my 5-year-old completely disagrees and is completely into doing it. I'm like, great. This is, you don't realize how beneficial this is to me as well. I'm like, yes, darling, you're so brilliant. And indeed, is absolutely brilliant, but then I get to play with all the little figures afterwards.
Something else that the kids love, I don't know how to explain this. So my 10-year-old saw the title of your book, Embers of the Hands, and said, that sounds really cool. And when you get a 10-year-old, like, that's a big deal. Where does Embers of the Hands come from?
Right. Okay. So I will tell you the story of how it came to be named that, because I sort of can't take full credit for that, but I have an agent out there, my literary agent, who is very smug about this. And then I'll tell you where the name actually come from. So Embers of the Hands, it was for ages. To be honest, we couldn't think of a title or like the title. And so it was a placeholder. And then it got nearer and nearer to publication and started to panic a little bit. Thought, can't think of anything better. And my agent said, look, this one is good. Keep it in. I said, that'd be stupid. No one's going to know what it means. He said, yeah, but it's a really good title. And so then finally they did a straw poll round the publishers, the UK publishers. Everyone went for Embers of the Hands. And so Embers of the Hands it is. I'm hoping he comes up with something brilliant for my next book. Because again, titles, not my forte. Building Lego, no. Titles, no. Hopefully the rest of it's all right. But so this is part of the reason that so much in I've got the US version over here, but you know, the UK version, you see it's similarly kind of blingy. It's got a lot of gold in it. That's partly because of what Embers of the Hands actually means. So it's a kenning, which is an old Norse sort of I call it a cryptic crossword clue. You know, it's something the Vikings or the Norse, whatever you want to call them, used in their fiendishly complicated poetry. And so it's how you describe something that might be quite ordinary by making it very convoluted and twisted and poetical, beautiful imagery. So in this case, Embers of the Hands initially meant gold. You know, it's something that glows and sparkles in your hands. And it comes from, now, if anyone's heard of a Viking, there's a good chance they've heard of Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 in England, right? So he's often used as a sort of standard date for the end of the Viking Age. But it's actually from one of his poems, or a poem written about him, that we find this kenning. So he does something wonderful while he's out in Byzantium, and he gets rewarded with embers of the hands, glóðum henda. But seeing as this book was about the ordinary, everyday humans who lived in the Viking Age, I thought, well, let's take that beautiful, sparkling, glowing idea of something that's precious, that's in your hands, and then make it into an ordinary sort of preciousness. So it's something that we could all relate to. I mean, sure, yeah, gold is nice, but if sort of, you know, if you suddenly had to leave your home at very short notice, the sorts of precious things you're likely to actually take with you, because they sort of, you know, connect to your soul, it's going to be, they're much more everyday items. And so that's what I wanted to get, this idea of a different sort of preciousness. That's in the title, but it also means I get to lean into the glitter and the gold. Talking of which, I mean, glitter, original Old Norse word, that is one of my absolute favorite words that we get in English from Old Norse, from the language the Vikings spoke. So I thought, yeah, let's lean into that one hard.
That one blew me away, that of all the stuff we can get from the Vikings, glitter.
I know, right? I mean, sure, skull, fine, dye, yeah, cake even, sure, but glitter, yeah, really like that one.
Now, as far as Vikings are concerned, I want to open this up for you. What's one thing that people think they know about Vikings that isn't actually true?
Oh,
and that you wanted to put it to bed right now. I think one of the big ones is they had horns on their helmets. Yeah. But is there any other ones where you're like, we need to stop it with this?
See, there are better, right? That's the cliche that they, and see, I can't say I do much to dispel that cliche of the Vikings wearing horned helmets, because when I sign books, I have a little cartoon Viking with horned helmets at the end. In fact, I was at a festival once signing books, and a small child came up to me and was absolutely furious and said, "You've just signed a book for my daddy, and look at this, you've put horns on the helmets. This is..." Got into a lot of trouble for that. But yeah, they didn't. But that's fine. We know that. I think there's a bigger one, which, again, I totally get it. But if we think of Viking, for good reason, and we can talk about why we think this, we think of someone who's male. We essentially think of someone who looks like you, right? Big beard and blonde, and kind of would look pretty at home with an axe in his hand, sort of in a boat sailing across an ocean.
I like to think so.
There you go. So yeah, basically, yeah, we put you in some sort of Viking garb, and there we've got a Viking. And it's true in the sense that the word Viking, in its original Old Norse form, and there's an Old English form as well, the language that was spoken around the same time in sort of parts of the British Isles, but that word Vikingur means raider or pirate most of the time. The ones doing that were male, of a certain age, of a certain sort of ability and social standing. So yeah, I get why that's the stereotype. But when we're talking about the Viking Age, or we're even thinking about that word Viking, but in a more expansive sense, which it sort of has now come to mean, and no one's come up with anything better, so sort of Viking it is. But, you know, we have to think of everyone else who's in that picture. We have to think of, well, certainly all the women for a start, but then people of different social status, so huge enslaved population in the Viking world. You have to think of the young and the old, and people living in all these extraordinary parts of the globe, everywhere from Greenland, you know, they lived there for sort of nearly 500 years, to Byzantium, to sort of the great waterways that sort of come down the Eurasian steppes, you know, towards Byzantium. So there's so much more to that picture than just that stereotype of the Viking raider. And I think that's what I would try and undercut, while at the same time saying, all right, yeah, there's a reason we think like that. Do you know what I mean? It's It makes sense. And it's part of the reason we're attracted to them. It's, it's the drama, it's the larger than life, it's the stories, it's the mythology, it's that sense of sort of edgy drama, right? That's why I got into them. That's why I'm not writing books about well-behaved monks, put it that way.
Yes, you don't know. Maybe.
Well, actually, no, there are some really badly behaved monks. Like in Anglo-Saxon England, they write scurrilously rude riddles, like really, really rude riddles. Actually, and I am writing about them a bit now, but I'm not writing about the well-behaved ones who just sat around having a good time. Right?
Now, one of the things that, especially with a book like this, and I say this in my review of the book because I don't mean to disparage archaeology type books, but they can be horribly boring, unlike this, which is fantastic. But something that a lot of people say is you have to write so often, this is what we think, this is what happened. For you, when you're writing or when you're out and you're looking at these things, is it a glass half empty or half full for you where you say, oh, there's so many questions I want answers to? Or do you look at it as, this tells me so much, even if it's not everything, you're still excited about what you did learn from an artifact or something like that?
Right. So break that question down a bit for me. So is it that we're starting from the premise that archaeology is a bit boring? Is there, I can say that I married an archaeologist. We're in a safe space. But it can be a bit dry. I agree. So then is the question, all right, how do we make those individual little artifacts exciting? Or why am I interested in this at all in the first place? Do we need to sort of approach this from an existential point of view? Because I can go down that route.
Oh, we'll break this down into like 5 different. Let me start with this way. When you're looking at these things, is it frustrating for you to not be able to answer all of these questions? Or are you excited just with what you can know from what you see?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so I quite like those grey spaces. So I always found, this sounds ridiculous, I found a certain type of history quite tedious in the same way that I find a certain type of archaeology quite tedious. Not because it's tedious in itself, but because I have a very short attention span, right? So it's definitely my problem, not their problem. But when you just see a series of dates and names, and then by the time you've got to the end of the page, you have to go back to the start again because you've forgotten the names of the people and you've forgotten, you know what I mean? It's like, that's not my idea of a good time. I've always been interested in stories. And that's why my first route into the Viking world was actually through the language, through the sagas, through the mythology. And so it's an interesting one because for me, what I'm interested in is what, say, an archaeological artifact or the absence of an artifact can tell us in terms of what's that story. What's that? And that might be the story of a life, or that might be story of a community, or the stories that they told about the world. But that's my way in. So I am not good at that. It's got to have a human connection for me. And because of that, I'm also really interested in those gaps where the evidence runs out. Of course, it's frustrating. You kind of feel, oh, come on, we're so close. There's so much more we can know. But, well, for a start, I like the possibility of more discoveries in the future. That's really exciting. Or new ways to look at the evidence that gives us different stories or different pictures or enhances what we already know. But I don't know, I'm also okay with the idea that, the past and the people of the past keep some of their secrets. I think that's quite attractive to me. I like the mystery.
Now, I don't want to beat up on your husband, the archaeologist, but as we said, it can be quite boring. You kind of already said it, so then the way you come across these things is you look at it and you say, how am I going to tell a story? I'm not just going to tell you about a skull with a hole in its head. I'm going to tell you how there might be a story around it to the best of what you can tell, right?
Yeah, and that's a really tricky one. I say it's tricky because it's great. When you've got a finished book, I'm going to, there it is. You're like, oh, well, that was easy. Well, that was, I just enjoyed every second of that adventure. It's a bit like childbirth. It's great after the event, right? But I'm now in the process of writing another one and grappling with the archaeology, the dates, and how to turn those ideas into stories again. And it turns out it's bloody hard. And I forgot how hard it was last time. So there's a lot of moving ideas about, and even when you've got an object, and we can talk about that skull in particular, because I think that is a really interesting one. That skull fragment moved all over the book. I think it was in 3 different sections. And the story was there. I knew why I wanted it in there, but it was, okay, where does it fit within that bigger story that I'm trying to tell? So, you know, so we should talk a bit. This is a skull fragment. It was found in Ribe in Denmark, and where it was found and when it came from, they're both really interesting questions to start with. So we've already talked about the Vikings as raiders. When we're thinking about that, it's really good to anchor ourselves in time, and we're talking about roughly the last decade of the 8th century. So that really famous raid on the island monastery of Lindisfarne, 793 off the northeast coast of England. You know, the dreadful sheets of lightning, fiery dragons seen flying through the air, the Vikings attack, all the monks get killed or captured and all their treasures get looted, right? So that's the sort of stereotype. What's really interesting is that this skull comes from the start of that century. So nearly a whole century earlier, we have this fragment of skull. And so it's just a bit, it's maybe, I don't know, it's like the size of a bank card, maybe a little bit bigger. It's sort of 6 centimeters by 8 centimeters, something like that. And it has a little, it's got a hole drilled through it as if someone's going to wear it as a necklace, except it's being drilled from the inside. So it's been drilled after death. Right? And that hole doesn't have any signs of wear. So it was never actually used. And this skull fragment was dropped in this very early trading town, Ribe in Denmark. And so we're already starting to see these, you know, the first little sparks of the Viking Age, because we've got international trade. We've got people looking outwards, coming from all different parts of the world. And that's a big part of, you know, why does the Viking Age happen? But then what we've got, and this is the fabulous part of the story, carved into this piece of human skull are runes, right? And so runes for me, and yeah, we can get into runes. You know, runes are just fabulous. They're this, most people will know what they are, this very spiky alphabet. And it's a very sort of Scandinavian thing, but of course they were used more widely than that. One possible translation of these runes is Ulf and Odin and High Tyr, and then something like help is brought against one dwarf, like a male dwarf, and a female dwarf, and then we're given a name, Bur. There's so much mystery in that. There's so much darkness in terms of what we can know. And then this skull fragment is this little bit of light. But what are we seeing there? We're seeing it within the context of international trade. We're seeing it within the context of the runic script that becomes increasingly important as we get into the Viking Age and even beyond. But we've also got the names of gods. We've got Odin, we've got Tyr, and then we've got Ulf, which just means wolf. So we're not quite sure, you know. So we've got whole belief systems, you know, just fragments of those encapsulated in this one artifact. And so for me, that's why it's so wonderful, because we can't fill in all the gaps, and we shouldn't try. I didn't want to sort of make it into a historical fiction where I then dress up this fragment of human skull with these runes in this marketplace at the dawn of the Viking Age with a story that we can't, basically a story that's better suited to historical fiction, which I absolutely love, by the way, but that's not what I can do here. But it's, what do we do with that fragment? How do we turn it into a human history and just a little tiny piece of it?
Well, the artifact, and honestly, I did my research, I watched some YouTube videos, and I was hoping to be the first one to ask about this, but everyone seems to love this one. Gita says that you should go home.
Oh, she's great.
Please tell everybody, where does that come from? What could it possibly mean? Because this is just my favorite.
Okay, so we've gone from the dawn of the Viking Age to, in some ways, what we might think of as the sunset or sort of the twilight or even beyond that of the Viking Age. We're in around 1200. And we're in Bergen in Norway, which is so I opened the chapter talking about Bergen and just the intense wetness. I lived there for a time, and I think there was one point it rained for 30 days straight, and I thought I was going to absolutely lose my marbles at that point. But so what's fabulous about Bergen is partly because of the wetness, not just the rain, but it's very watery. It's on the coast, but in the Viking Age, or sort of late Viking Age, heading out of that time, there was this sort of jetty, they call it bryggen, sort of this harbour space where you have traders coming in and out, and you have kind of taverns, pubs, and you have, the ships at the dock waiting to go off on their sort of fabulous adventures, to sort of Greenland in some cases, and certainly, to Europe more widely. And because of the waterlogged conditions there, it's archaeologists again, our unsung heroes, right? The cool kids, because they found, and this is back in the 1950s, there was a big fire. And in Bryggen, when they were sort of like pouring through the remnants of this fire and all these burnt wooden buildings, they found all these little rune sticks. And so they're runes again, this spiky lettering, but they're just mostly little fragments of wood. There's a bit of bone, there's a bit of metal, there's all sorts, but these are essentially sort of like post-it notes or text messages, or I don't know what they're called, but if you go to a supermarket and you get how much something costs, and so it's just, they're very ordinary, they're very everyday, and there's over 700 of them. So there's this wonderful sort of encapsulation of all human life is here, essentially. And it's into this context that we find Gyða. And it seems to be, and again, we've got to be careful not to overfill in those blank spaces, but she seems to be pretty cross. And she's written this little runic text message, as it were, this little short length of wood. We think, because of where it was found, but again, we can't tell for sure, to someone who essentially has stayed out too long and may well be in the pub having a drink or two or three, because these runes, now if I find them, because I can give you the old Norse, so transliterated sort of into Roman letters, they say Gyða segir að du kak heim, which basically means Gyða says that you should go home. And so it looks like she's carved this onto this piece of wood and sent it off to whoever her errant husband or whoever it is in the pub, possibly. But then what's even more wonderful is that on the other side, it looks like someone's tried to reply and they've tried to carve runes back. And for me, again, we've got to be careful because I can't say this for sure, but it just looks like, we've all sent them or possibly received them, but it's like a drunken text message that you when you're trying so hard not to come across as drunk and you're saying, I'm 5 minutes away, I'm on the bus, and you're absolutely not 5 minutes away on the bus. And of course, what you send is absolute drivel and there's no sentence, because the runes on the other side of this actually don't make any sense at all. We don't have a clue what's being said. And so for me, it's always that husband thing. It's okay, I know exactly.
Listen, you can't say it as the historian, right? You have a reputation to uphold. I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to assume that her husband's name is Bjorn. That's the first one that came to me. Yep. Bjorn's hammered at the pub. Gyða hands it to one of the kids, says, go find your father. And then he's like, I'll tell her where I'm going. And then somehow that falls, and now we're talking about it hundreds of years later.
See, obviously, I never said any of that. I'm a professional historian, and I have a reputation to uphold, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, that's
I have no reputation. That's what I said. That's what happened.
Right, but the thing is, there are other sticks that basically have the equivalent of that, and there's definitely drink involved. There's one, it says something like, I wish I could come to the mead house more often.
Well, I think it's so easy to forget because we think of things... And it's very often, kings and their scribes and queens writing these very fancy things. But they were just as filthy and childish as we are today. It's just very often we don't get to see those later on.
Exactly. And these are the bits I like. I mean, not at the expense of, there's plenty of other stuff in there that isn't just sort of toilet humor, basically. It comes back to that question that you posed about, okay, what about those spaces in between? And there is that to consider. So the whole time you're looking at this, sometimes it just feels really familiar and you feel like, I know this person. And maybe we do. But at the same time, we have to remember that these are all people living in a very different world, very different social context, period of history. It's the cliche that life is cheaper, but certainly there's a different sense of what's normal in this world. But again, I like that. I like that sort of knowable unknowability. I think that's a very important thing to be able to hold. People like us, but also not like us.
Like us, but not like us, but sort of like us. Because
but sort of like us, a bit like us.
Still children. On children all the time. When it comes to actual artifacts, I noticed this from the book. We get so much from Iceland. Iceland is very, very heavy when we're looking at the, historical record. For the listeners, why is Iceland so kind of outsized in comparison to a lot of other places?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd sort of caveat, no one's quite sure. We've got some ideas. Certainly there are some things that seem very likely, but it is unusual. It is outsized, as you say. So part of it is that when it comes to the textual records, runes aside, if we're looking at that core of the Viking Age, which we might say is sort of from the 8th century to the 11th century, although you'll know from my book, I sort of say, look, we've really got to expand those lines. There's no sort of firm edges. But because they're not Christianized at the same as early as other European cultures, they don't have the accoutrements of Christianity, which are, for example, manuscripts, that sort of long form writing and annals. What they have instead are very developed, long sort of oral traditions where information is passed down the generations. And what's wonderful is because then Christianity does come to the Nordic world sort of around the year 1000 or so, there's the opportunity for those oral narratives and records to find their way into those manuscripts because they're just that little bit later. And so the really obvious example, they're not so much in this book, they were sort of really heavy feature of my last book, are the Icelandic sagas. And saga, it's these long form stories. We still use the word if we're going to say, oh God, the saga of me getting to work this morning usually means you were stuck in a traffic jam, right? But it's this sense of these expansive, often multi-generational tales. And the really interesting thing about where they come from and what they are and to what extent they're history or they're fiction or they're somewhere in the middle is sort of encapsulated in that word saga, which comes from the Old Norse verb sort of at segja, to tell, to say, and that sense of it being something that's orally passed down. So there are lots of oral records and there's the survival. It doesn't mean there weren't oral records outside Iceland, but they survive. Part of the reason they survive is because when we get to the 13th century, we've got this horrible, really bloody, horrible civil war in Iceland. And on the edges of the civil war, as the sort of the 6 main families are sort of warring between each other for power, we have the Norwegian king. The Norwegian king is basically egging them on and saying, yeah, do you know what he said about you? Yeah, go on, you get in there. Because the Norwegian king would quite like to take over Iceland and have the power. And actually, one of the biggest people that we know, sort of the writers, the poets, the person we know was recording a lot of these stories is a man called Snorri Sturluson. He's a politician, he's a poet, he's a saga writer. And he is actually, in the end, killed on the orders of the Norwegian king because he gets so caught up in this horrible civil war. And so we've got to think culturally, by the 13th century, the Icelanders know that their way of life is coming to an end, this sense of them as a sort of independent commonwealth. And so what often happens in any culture at that point is you start to look back to the past, and you also want to make sure that you're recording that past, because encapsulated in that past is that sense of your own independent identity. And so it's at that point when we have, the political situation, the social situation, the tools to write them down. We have sort of a few monasteries knocking around as well, but we have farmers writing over the long, dark Icelandic winters in their farmhouses. We have those stories being written down. There's a writer from around that time that says the Icelanders are the storytellers, they're the history keepers of the Nordic world. And so even at the time, there's very much a sense that they're there and they are sort of on the edge of all things, observing and writing, but also writing their own past into that bigger world.
Going a little bit further west from Iceland, how much money would you have to be paid to be one of the first people to land in Greenland? Because I still, every time I read about it, I go, and I'm sure Greenland is lovely. I've been to Iceland. I have not been to Greenland, but I've seen pictures. I just can't imagine somebody landing and going, yeah, this will work. We can figure it out. Yeah, sure. We're farmers, right? Yeah, we can do that. And from what we know, as you already said, hundreds of years they were there. How? I'm just going to say how. You go with this question,
right.
How?
Okay. So there are many questions there. The first one about how much money, no money in the world could you give me? But I'm sort of like notoriously, I get more seasick than you can possibly imagine. I'm also vegan. I'm the worst Viking historian ever. It's frankly embarrassing. Right?
How could you even understand? Are you going to tell me you don't drink meat either?
Oh, I do drink a little bit of meat.
All right, there we go.
Little bit of meat. Yeah, that's right. But no, I would not last 5 minutes. Not 1 minute out there. Okay. But Greenland is the part of the Norse world that I have been sort of drawn to, fascinated by since I first knew anything about the Vikings, since I first sort of discovered their literature and their language at university. It was like, oh my goodness, Greenland. Now, part of that is exactly for the reasons you say. It's why and how and oh my goodness, seriously. But having said that, right, so we go back to Greenland. It's founded in terms of a Norse colony at the end of the 10th century. We've got Eric the Red, very famously. He starts off in Norway, gets exiled to Iceland for some killings, and then he sort of gets up to his old tricks in Iceland and gets exiled for 3 years this time for some killings, and he decides to head off west, and he sails up and down that west coast of Greenland, right? The fact that it's the west coast is really important. If he'd landed in the east coast, game over. It is icy, and from a sort of northern European medieval farming hunting perspective, no way, it's not going to happen. They have these, going to pronounce it badly now, but they have these horrible, what they call catabaric winds. They're called pitarak or something. It means that which attacks you, that comes down off the ice sheets in Greenland, off the glaciers, and sort of like down onto the east coast. It's not habitable as far as the Norse were concerned. The west coast, or rather the sort of southern bit of the west coast before you get to the Arctic Circle, that's a different matter. So you've got these beautiful, very lush, richly sort of, well, I say rich, I mean, it's all relative, right? But certainly they are, relatively speaking, lush fjord systems where you can set up longhouses, where you can farm if you do it right, if you know what you're farming. So sort of wheat, barley, forget it. They tried. Didn't really work. They wouldn't have seen bread from 1 year to the next for the most part. But certainly if you've got goats, you've got sheep, maybe a few cows if you're lucky, although they're going to have to stay inside for 8 months of the year because the problem is the long, cold winters. And I always feel really sorry for Norse Greenlandic cows because apparently they had to they like shoved them in the byres for 8 months in the darkness. And then by the time it gets to spring, you know, they're up to their necks in their own poo. They've probably been fed seaweed a lot of the winter, and then they have to be carried out because they're so skinny and you know, into the fields as the grass comes in, right? So yeah, it's not great, but it's doable. And the conditions were slightly better then than they have been sort of for the past few hundred years. That's part of the reason they go there. But there are other reasons to go there as well that are really important. And for that, you have to look up the coast, past the Arctic Circle, into what they called Norðursetur, so the northern hunting grounds, because there you had the great Arctic riches, and particularly walrus. So walrus ivory, hugely valuable, hugely sought after. And so for the Norse, who had access to that as hunters, because they were farmers, yes, but they were also hunters, they could get huge amounts of sort of money, yes, but sort of goods or bargaining power. You know, they used to pay their tithes to the Norwegian crown and church in the form of things like walrus ivory. It's so valuable. And so what that means is the ships, for a while, for a few hundred years, they keep coming. And that's really important because, and this is something I talk about, as the ships, for many reasons, stop coming, particularly from Norway, then life gets a lot harder for the Norse Greenlanders, because the sort of, as I say, the sort of things you need to maintain a particular type of North European society at that time, that's not all there. On the other hand, you can also look west. And that's when it gets really interesting, because of course, what's west from Greenland is the edge of the North American continent. And we know that is somewhere that they reach around the year 1000. And what's interesting there is that according to the sagas, they basically come down that coast. So they go past Baffin Island, which they call Hetluland. It means sort of like stone slab island. No resources there to speak of. They get further south, they get to Labrador, and that's markland for them, which is forest land. And then they come to Newfoundland, they call Vinland, because we start to see real resources. We know that they get further south from there, down to the St. Lawrence River, that sort of area. And so there are resources in that part of the world. And when you think of the Norse, they're spreading out in all directions at that point from essentially their homelands of Scandinavia. So you've got to think, okay, there is stuff out there for them. If you think of Greenland as part of this chain of communication, this cultural diaspora that spreads all the way across the North Atlantic.
We're skipping over something here, though. Just to go back real quick, you get off the boats. They're like, all right, we can make work of this. Okay, it's Greenland. And it's like, but even you said, oh, you got to build your longhouse. There's no wood. There's no wood. And then they go to North America on the continent. They see someplace and say, we're even going to call this as a bunch of wood. But it's like, take the wood back to Greenland. Why not just stay there? I don't know. We don't know why. But I have a lot of questions, Eleanor.
Okay, so let's go into some of those questions. Right, so when they first arrive in Greenland, there's not a lot of wood. There's a bit of wood, and there's also driftwood that comes over from Siberia. I love that. It's all woodwormed and eaten, but there's some like chunky logs coming over from Siberia. So for a while, they can do some stuff with that. And it's also possible that they're importing timber from Norway, essentially sort of at the height when the most ships are coming, right? So there's a bit going on there. It's not completely devoid of trees, but certainly it's not good if you want to, I don't know, say build a ship, which is kind of quite important if you want to go anywhere. Jane Smiley, in her book The Greenlanders, the historical fiction, oh my goodness, she explores this so well. This sort of, as your options just start to run out and the wood disappears, and over the generations you can just see this inexorable decline. I mean, she does it so well. The thing with Marklands and these resources on the edge of North American continent is there are other people there first. And this is an example where the sagas, those, stories written down in Iceland later on, but based on these oral traditions, are really useful. So the most important sagas, as far as we're concerned, when we're looking at Greenland and that sort of exploration of the North American continent, are called the Vinland sagas. And that's two sagas. It's the saga of Eric the Red, Eric Saga Reide, and it's the saga of the Greenlanders, which is Grænlendinga saga. Now, they're full of all sorts of crazy stuff as well. We've got walking zombies, we've got sort of flesh-eating worms, we've got, some really crazy stuff that we wouldn't think of as historical in our sense of the word. But we've also clearly got historical traditions and ideas that are being passed down and real people who existed in some form. It's the reason that in the 60s, when the archaeologists decided, okay, we're going to look over here, they found the only real sort of substantial archaeological evidence of the Norse building houses at the tip of Newfoundland, which sort of they weren't going to live in permanently, and we don't see any burials, we don't see any rubbish pits full of stuff, but it's somewhere they can overwinter, they can sort of gather resources, mend their ships, and then maybe explore further south and further inland. The interesting thing about the sagas, though, is that one thing they do tell us is that there were interactions between the Norse who made their way to the North American continent and the people who were already living there, the indigenous tribes. And it's a really interesting one because, again, we can't say this is all historically true, but we can look at those general themes and those general ideas. And it starts off as a sort of, okay, we can trade here. You've got something we want. We've got something you want. But then before too long, it degenerates and it becomes killings, essentially. And it's nasty. And on both sides, but I would say definitely more on the Norse side, doing the perpetuating of that.
It's kind of their thing if you look at it.
This is it, right? It's an interesting one because, I suppose that's another myth, sort of going back to your very first question, I would dispel, which is this idea that all they do is they turn up and they raid and they murder. they're actually masters of cultural assimilation as well. We see that in other parts of the world, sort of Normandy, northern France, sort of down the waterways of now what's like Ukraine, Russia, all those areas. So it's not always true, but it's certainly true in this case. Yeah, it's not good. And in the end, one of the Norse, again, according to the sagas, he says, we found a land of fine resources, but we're not going to be able to use them, i.e. we'd like to settle, but someone else is already here. And so back they go, taking what they can. Having said that, although we have absolutely no evidence to say that they did try and settle, we don't know what we don't know, but yeah, it seems unlikely. We do have this really interesting entry, an annal entry from Iceland in the 1300s. So we're talking hundreds of years after what we know happened. We know that the Norse from Greenland reached the edge of North America. But then this is, I don't know, it's like 1367 or something. I'll look it up. It's something like that. It's 1300s. And this annal account says a ship was washed up and they came from Markland. They'd been at Markland. It was this tiny little ship and it didn't have an anchor. And clearly they've been completely blown off course and they've ended up in Iceland. And so we can only think, okay, the reason that they are in Markland is because they're still possibly from Greenland collecting supplies, and Markland, forest land, probably collecting wood. I love that annal entry, even if I can't remember the name, the date off the top of my head. But I think it's a wonderful moment again of just this little spark lit in the darkness that in a way it tells you something's there, but at the same time you suddenly realize how much darkness there is.
All right, well, I want to do some time traveling with you. I'm going to send you back to, let's say, the year 1000. Let's just make it nice and OCD, solid number.
Okay.
I send you back there. You have to play a Viking board game.
Ooh, nice. Okay.
Which one's it going to be? Which one are you picking?
Oh, all right. Okay, so we're just before 1000. We're 10th century, all right? So this thing is still knocking around. All right, okay. So it is not so much about the game, because as far as the Norse was concerned, there was one board game that they absolutely loved, and this was called Nefertitle. Okay, so it just basically sounds like someone is sneezing all over the place when you say it, right? But it means sort of like fist table. And it's got this, you imagine a kind of grid, and in the middle of this grid, you've got the king piece. And surrounding, I'm sort of hesitating because we don't really actually know exactly how it was played, but the king seems to have been protected by a series of smaller pieces. And rather wonderfully, I love this, they are female, which I rather love. So he's got these badass bodyguards around him, and I think the idea is probably he's got to get to the edge of the board, but there are other pieces on there from the opposing team trying to chase him down. So that's Nefertitle. So I mean, if I'm going to go Viking, I've got to play that game, right? And you find it everywhere. You find archaeologists have found boards of these, this game up in sort of all sorts of unlikely places where they've just been sort of scratched onto random pieces of stone, and they don't even realize they're board games until it starts raining, and so everyone's playing it. All
right, listen, we're still time traveling. I'm going to let you talk to anyone from the book for just an hour, okay?
Ooh.
Now, just an hour, because first of all, we've already stated you would die immediately, so we're only giving you an hour.
I would. I don't think I'll last an hour, to be honest, but yeah.
Number 2, it can't be Gita, because that's too easy.
All right.
Anyone else from your book? It can even be a few people who are trying to get some... They're up in northern Greenland, and they're probably not going to make it to the end of the day. Whoever you want, not Gita.
So I have 2, and I also have a cheap one who's not in the book, so I won't mention him. He's this sort of Arctic explorer. Again, he was much more in my last book, so I didn't put him in this one, but I just want to go and meet him. I did a whole documentary where I was basically on his trail, going around the Arctic coast of Norway, trying to work out where he went. So he's my absolute, I just love him. But leaving him aside, because I play by the rules, and you said it's got to be someone in this book, right? We're going to go for 2. The first is exactly as you say. It's someone, or rather 3 people, because I'm being a little bit sneaky, but they're all on one runic inscription, okay? And it's up in the far, far north of the west coast of Greenland, so way beyond where they actually were able to live. And it's in this place they called Norðursetur. So it's where they hunted walrus ivory and other sort of Arctic goods. And it's an island called a Kingetorsuaq, something like that. And it's this little island. And on this island, people back in the 19th century, I think, they found these little cairns piled high with stones. They thought, that's a bit odd. They looked inside them, and in one of them, they found this piece of stone carved with runes. And these runes talk about 3 people who essentially find themselves up in this high Arctic, past Disco Bay, past Ilulissat, on this sort of uninhabited rocky island. And it says it's something like Erling and Bjarni and Eindriði. They carved these runes, and they even they say the time of year, it's minor irrigation day, which is I think the end of April. This is not a good time for Norse hunters to be up there. They've probably been there over winter. It would be very hard to get back. You have to wonder whether they were sort of intending to be there over winter, but they've made it to this point in the year when spring is a distant glimmer on the horizon, but at least it's on the horizon. I just want to talk to them. I want to know what they were doing up there, what life was like, what it was like to, again, as a vegan, this feels like a very inappropriate thing, but you're hunting these huge, blubbery, muscly beasts. What's it like? This is such an alien world for me. And this is, it comes back to this fascination, perpetual fascination I've got with Greenland. So I want to meet them. The other one is going to take us way to sort of thousands of kilometers in the opposite direction to Novgorod. And sort of, again, it's very late in terms of what we would think of as the Viking Age, to the point where the person that I want to meet there doesn't speak Old Norse, and he's not writing in a sort of runic script. He's writing in a Cyrillic script, and he's writing on birch bark. So Novgorod was settled by the Norse at the end of the 9th century. And Novgorod is a really important sort of squelchy, boggy island in terms of this multicultural culture, polity, they call Kievan Rus. It's founded by the Norse, but they're a very small Scandinavian minority in this huge area of Slavic speaking tribes, and quite quickly they assimilate. So it comes back to what I was saying before, sort of cultural assimilation is a really important part of the Viking Age story as well. But by the time we get to this little character that I would love to meet so much, we're way past that. So he's writing on birch bark in Cyrillic script, and he's called Onfim. And he is, he's this mighty warrior on horseback, and he's this wild beast that breathes fire, and he's a diligent scholar in the classroom. But what I love about Onfim is he's also a little child. And we have, I think, over a dozen of these little birch bark pieces that survive in his hand. And some of them are sort of school exercises, but the ones that I absolutely love are his little pieces of artwork where he's clearly, again, he's lost interest. His mind has wandered off. And so there's one where he's drawing his classmates, in front of their teacher in the schoolroom. Or there's another where, he's sort of imagined himself as this wild beast. And we know that because he says, I am a wild beast. And it looks like he's breathing fire. And there's others where, he's this tiny little warrior next to a bigger warrior. And you think, is that his dad? Is that his brother? Who is that? There's something about Onfim that I don't know. Yeah. So he's, I don't know, when is he writing? It's sort of, I think it's the 13th century. And at that point, we still have echoes. We have tiny little echoes fading of this Norse heritage. We have people with Norse names, for example. But for him, there's something, for me, I find it very difficult to shake that he is this little child, because you've read the book, you've seen some of these images, and those, one thing that he's still sort of, his brain, his fine motor skills, they're no different to a child nowadays, even if he's living in a very different world. And those pictures, there's just something so viscerally human and childlike and intensely touching, quite emotional about those pictures. And so for me, I say I want to meet him. That's a point where I almost don't want to meet him, because I don't want to know what happened to him, because I'm so desperate for him to have grown up and had a good life. And I have absolutely no idea if he did. And I know he lived, 9 centuries ago. And for me, that's the point. I find it quite hard to write those bits, because that's the bits where the humanity comes out. And it's something, so in the very last, no spoilers, it's not that sort of book, but in the very last paragraph of the book, I talk about that sense of bearing witness to the people of the past, and sort of you gather them up into your new stories. And in Onfim, it's that. So I suppose sort of in the Greenlandic hunters, Arctic hunters, there's that sense of alienness, like utter alienness. It's just something that I almost can't get my head around. But with Onfim, it's the opposite. It's that sense of that shared humanity. And sometimes you reach that point where it's almost too close. Do you know what I mean? It just becomes almost painful to write about. And Onfim is one of those moments for me.
I think it is that parent side.
Yes.
Where you're talking about a child and you're kind of like, oh, I also know too much, and that I know how badly this can go, where cut on a finger becomes gangrene, all of these horrible things that can happen. Whereas, the 3 hunters, they're hunting. They might be like 18 and they've had a long life for then.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I have to ask this question. Have you seen the TV series Vikings or even The Last Kingdom?
Yes.
Do they drive you nuts? Are you able to just divorce and say, no, this is fun, this is good time?
I love them.
You love them?
I love. Occasionally not. Okay, so I feel sort of bad saying one. Like, what was it? Kind of Vikings, Ragnarok. The one where they go to Greenland and North America. I just didn't think that was
Valhalla,
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I was very excited. I like that part of the world in the Norse. I may have mentioned that once or twice. I didn't think it was great storytelling. However, I just love good stories, right? In Vikings, the TV series, they're clearly eliding sort of centuries of history, but also centuries of sort of myth and legend and stuff. I'm great with that. I don't mind that, as long as if you sort of say this is a real story, then it's annoying. But I think the wonderful thing about TV shows like that, certainly like The Last Kingdom, the books that sort of The Last Kingdom comes from, also I'm a big fan of that sort of stuff, because it comes back to what we're saying about those empty spaces. Those empty spaces, if you want to fill them, you have to turn to your imagination. And for me, I mean, facts, no, but I get so much of my sort of imaginative world building as a historian from sort of, historical fiction, if it's books, or from, the films and the TV. This is where I started. I mean, I started with, I don't know if it's so well known in the US, but Nog in the Nog, this little Viking, he's like this little cartoon. He's from sort of, I don't know, in the 70s, he's like the gentle king of the Northmen, and you have this like rather mournful oboe playing in the background, sort of big British classic, based actually artistically on the Lewis chess pieces, which do appear in my book many times. But then like sort of, I don't know, you start with the cartoons, you start with the stories, with the books, with the TV shows, with the films, and that's where that spark comes from. And I suppose maybe not everyone needs that, but maybe that's why I write the kind of books I write. Maybe that comes back to exactly that first point, which is I need the human connection. I need the storytelling connection. I need the imaginative hook that makes me sort of care. So I love all that sort of stuff.
So we have set up that you have definitely watched TV and movies.
Yeah.
Besides researching, do you have time to read nonfiction just for fun? Do you have any favorites? Or if you want to answer a different question, do you have friends who have books coming out and you want to plug them? I just want to know what historians are reading.
So I wouldn't see me as representative at all of what historians are reading. I'm a appalling historian. You should see the rubbish that's by my bed, right? I have sort of multiple books on rotation the whole time, okay? But they're all really different types of books. When I'm actively researching and writing, and that's sort of the stage I'm in now for a new book, I actually find it really hard to read historical nonfiction for fun, honestly, because it just feels like work, right? And often when I get into bed, and we've already mentioned the sort of small humans who kind of enrich, but also
rule your world.
My life
Got it.
So much, right? Rule my world, yeah, like tiny little Valkyrie gods, right? Often I'm rolling into bed. I just want to sort of stare at RuPaul's Drag Race on repeat and not have to use any part of my brain, right?
Lady history nerd's favorite. I'm judging a little bit.
There you go. I'm with her and we are right, is all I'm going to say. It's like, yeah. So in terms of what I read for fun, when I am at sort of this stage where I'm trying to like actually sort of galvanize my brain and into doing kind of work stuff, because this is part of it, sort of as a sort of slightly tangential point, to try and make stuff interesting. I say very much the operative word in what I write for other people who are reading it. I've got to read so much stuff that is not particularly interesting, in that it's quite dry, right? So I then develop a very low threshold for dry. And so where I get my historical kicks from actually comes back to mostly historical fiction, which I am a huge fan of when it's done well. When it's sort of heaving bosoms and everything, I'm like, oh, please, come on. So I, at the moment, have been working my way through, she's this amazing British writer, S.G. MacLean, and she writes, so the best series, and there's many of them, but it's about this, he's a government agent called Seeker. It's sort of a political thriller, murder mystery sometimes. It's set in what I used to think of as the driest time in British history, which is sort of the Protectorate. So after they chop Charles I's head off, Oliver Cromwell comes in, Christmas stops, all the fun stops, no drinking, no dancing. I always thought, well, I'm not going to bother with that. Now I'm thinking, thanks to these Seeker books, maybe I should have retrained and that should be my specialism, right? So again, it's about bringing these historical worlds to life.
There are people who look at history and they say it's super boring. I took it in school. I don't want to read nonfiction for a lot of the reasons you kind of alluded to. I sat one of them in front of you and they said, Eleanor, why should I read Embers of the Hands? What would you say?
Well, I would for a start be very British and then say, well, let's just talk generally about why you should read history, okay? But what I would genuinely say is I've always liked history, but I didn't always like reading history because it's like a load of elite white males sort of chopping each other's arms off in battle. You know what I mean? It's like that for me. I thought that was history. And what I try and do when I'm writing, in Embers and sort of anything else I write as well, and it's sort of like what I try and do when I'm broadcasting, when I'm on the BBC, whatever it is storytelling. And it's storytelling that touches us as humans. So we have already that shared story with the people of the past because we share humanity, which means we share all the good bits and all the rubbish bits of, of that state of being. But for me, it's a history that, in Embers, we're going down to the little bits and pieces of humanity that fall between the floorboards because they're not exciting enough to end up in the annals or sort of in the great lists of kings. But also there's a more general, maybe this is because where I started, it was sort of the stories, the myths, the sagas, I love history that allows for those different layers of being human, where you're human on that sort of practical, physical, visceral, everyday level where, for example, I've got the giant fossilized poo, it's like, we've all got to go and do that, right? Let's talk about that physical process of being human, or what it's like to be a child, or what it's like to give birth, or, be old, or whatever it is. There's something shared there. But there's also that level of being human that I think increasingly I can't shake. And I explore it to some extent in Embers, but it's this idea that humans don't just exist on that physical, biological level. They exist in the worlds they carry with them in their heads, in the stories they tell, in the poems and the myths and the legends. And I think that is as important a part of that human story, that shared humanity. And so that is also what I try and bring out where I can. It's where those two worlds meet. It's that overlap, that for me, I would say that's why you should read history. I mean, because not all history is like that, but that is what I try and do. I think before I'm a historian, I'm a storyteller.
I can add for you, the most surprising thing about this is with archaeology books, very often they are, here's this, here's this, here's this, I've now told you the story. Whereas in this book, I think the biggest surprise is when you get towards the back chapters, you're pulling things in from the first few chapters. They aren't just things that you've thrown, and you mentioned it with the skull, with the hole in the head. You're telling a full story that comes full circle, which very often they don't do that. And that was, I got to the end, I'm like, wait a second, I already heard about that guy. Eleanor set me up. She set me up.
Yeah, the whole of the chapter 9, the enslaved chapter, is basically a setup. I was quite, I mean, who knows if it works or not, but I was quite pleased. Yeah, but I think that's it. I think, and this is it, whether I'm doing it on the radio or I'm doing it in books, whatever it is, I want to tell stories, and it's finding ways to tell that story, or those stories that make them something you want to hear. Because otherwise, yeah, quite frankly, it's like, why should people spend money buying my book? But I kind of feel that because I'm a reader as well. I'm like, yeah, go on, tell me why I should read this. Tell me why I should care. I think that's a completely legitimate question. I don't mind that challenge. I think that's actually a completely fair enough challenge.
Well, listen, I got the book for free, but I would have paid for it if I had to.
Well, you had to do this, though. That's why,
yeah, that's
right?
Right. Yeah. That's exactly why. It's not because I'm an egomaniac and I want stuff for free. Eleanor, the book is really, really fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Oh, it's just such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And that's it for this episode. Eleanor, thank you so much. Embers of the Hands, absolutely amazing. Going to be one of my books of the year. Pick it up. Trust me. In the meantime, hit us up on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.